Hello and welcome to the AIA Canada 2022 Outlook Study webinar. I'm excited to present the findings of this report, and I have the EY team and our president, Jean-François Champagne, with us. Before I proceed, a quick thank you to our sponsors, without whose financial contribution this report would not have been possible. Also, a thank you to our strategic research partners, whose data contribution added value to the report. And lastly, our community of practice for the 2022 Outlook study, whose guidance, validation, and verification helped us reach the report in its final form. Also, special thanks to Michael Chung, who is ever so helpful with our research initiatives. I would now like to ask JF to provide a quick message for our members today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Shamsia, and welcome to everyone. AIA Canada is pleased to present the finding from our 2022 Outlook study. You may recall this is the second time we are producing this report in partnership with the EY, and we're very pleased to have them join us today to present a report. But again, I'd like to point out again that we are also doing this in collaboration this year with SMP and IMR to further enhance the quality of the information that we are providing to our members. I know our members are always looking forward to the release of this report, and I'm sure that it will be once again very well received. And thank you again for participating. Back to you, Shamsia.
Thank you, JF. For the next 30 minutes, we'll be hearing from the EY team, who will walk us through some of the key findings. This will be followed by a Q&A session. We have a comprehensive list of questions planned for today's session, but if you feel that there are any further questions, please reach out to us. We will be sharing an email address towards the end, and we definitely want to keep the engagement going, and we want to hear from our members, your feedback, your comments, so that we could continue to add value to our members with good quality data. On that note, let's move to the EY team for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Shamsia, and hello everyone. We are very pleased here to present our findings of the Automotive Aftermarket Outlook study for this year. As we mentioned, we're very excited that we have new data to show you and new analysis, and to provide you a great context in terms of where we've been, where we are, and also where we're going. So as part of this study, we will first begin looking at the Canadian aftermarket sector. And here I'll pass it over to our senior economist in our team in a moment, but we'll be speaking about just the general overview of the aftermarket sector economic footprints, and then understanding what are those product and service offerings and how has that transformed over the last few years. After, we'll then speak in more detail around the demand or aftermarket sector demand analysis, really understanding the drivers of aftermarket demand and doing a deeper dive into the Canadian aftermarket and understanding where is it that will place you and where we believe the market is going in the next 5 years. In saying that, I will pass it over to Ryan to walk us through at a very high summary level the market. Ryan.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcel. So on the first slide here, we're showing some of the analysis we've done. To engage the health of the aftermarket sector, we examined many macroeconomic indicators, including GDP, demand for products and services, as well as employment. We found that the demand shocks caused by public health restrictions to curb the spread of COVID-19, as well as the supply chain disruptions, have resulted in the sector's lower economic output in the last 2 years. As you can see on the left here, the GDP in 2020 decreased by nearly 11%. In 2021, however, the sector has seen strong recovery, posting a year-over-year growth of nearly 7%. This was mostly because of the return of demand for auto repair and maintenance. On the right-hand side, we can see at the industry level, the recovery has been uneven. Industries like automotive parts and accessories and tire stores and automotive repair and maintenance industries have enjoyed a V-shaped recovery, whereas other industries like auto parts and manufacturing has seen slower growth. The non-core aftermarket has performed mostly in line with the overall Canadian economy, mostly due to the strong growth in the other general merchandise stores industry in 2020 and 2021. On the employment side, we're seeing a similar trend. When we compare the employment levels over the last 2 years with 2019, as shown on the left, the pandemic has caused a decline of almost 6% in aftermarket workforce in 2020, with the core aftermarket sectors suffering most of the job losses. And in comparison, the non-core aftermarket industries have weathered better. Employment recovery across the sector in 2021 was strong, with the core industries recouping nearly 11,000 jobs. The sector overall was just shy of 10,000 jobs from a full recovery. And when we look at employment through a provincial lens, as shown on the right-hand side here, we see a similar story. While all the provinces have suffered employment losses in 2020, most have added jobs back in 2021, with Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia already getting back to the pre-pandemic levels. And lastly, we've looked at the demand for aftermarket products and services. The pandemic has resulted in a demand shock, and it has since been compounded by a severely disrupted global supply chain, which have left many businesses facing a supply constraints in the last 2 years, as evidenced by the Canadian imports of automotive products, which have seen a significant decline. In 2021, for example, the imports have remained 25% below the 2019 levels. And the supply side constraints have likely spilled over into 2022, largely resulting from China's zero-COVID policy as well as Russia's war in Ukraine. On the service side, the quantity of automotive technicians is used as a proxy for demand. And we can see from the chart on the right-hand side, the pandemic has certainly put a dent on the service demand in 2020. However, its return in the following year has been very strong and swift. So just to summarize, when we look at GDP, workforce, and demand from a macro level, the sector has shown great resiliency in the past year and is on track to a full recovery soon. And next, I will pass over to Mauricio for a deep dive into the demand analysis for the sector.
Thank you, Ryan. So as part of this section here, we'll be looking at what are those drivers of aftermarket demand. We'll be then looking at and doing a much deeper dive into the aftermarket, as you'll see here on vehicles that have been registered or in operation, and then also just doing a deeper understanding of how that has looked like in terms of revenue perspective. And so when we think about what those drivers of demand are, naturally we think about consumer spending, and we think about how that has changed from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. And during the last 12 to 18 months of market hysteria, there's been now this what we'll call an expectation of a looming recession, which actually causes expectations for consumers to whether purchase larger items now or later, which would also result in purchases of new vehicles and perhaps using or repairing of some essential or non-essential items. So in this particular case, for this slide here, I think this is one of the great data that we were able to work with S&P on. But this actually breaks down the vehicles in operations by body type, right? So we think about light trucks and passenger cars, and we think of how that's grown over the last few years and where those vehicles in operations are located. So as you can see on the bottom left-hand side, a large proportion, almost 10 million, are located in Ontario. And then over time, how that's changed as well. So we often see that there's been now this preference of shifting away from just, say, passenger's car, and actually this large growth towards the light truck segment. And so when we think about this at the aggregate on the top right-hand side, we expect, based on forecasts from S&P, that there's a large growth in vehicles in operation by 2028, almost a growth rate of 2% per year. So going from about 26 million to up towards 30 million. What we also find very interesting, also and very insightful, is the bottom right-hand corner, which actually breaks down the vehicles in operations by model year. So as you can see now that there's a larger distribution or larger amount of vehicles in operation that are coming out of warranty, so to speak, and now entering the new aftermarket area. So there's a lot of opportunities to understand some of this. Moving on to the next slide. I think another great data point that has really enriched this study from the previous years is using streetlight data to understand the vehicle kilometers traveled across Canada. And here we have broken down in two different components. One is the total vehicle kilometers traveled by each quarter from 2019 to 2022. We overlay what we call, from a data perspective, the COVID-19 stringency index, which proxy shutdowns and openings in the economy. And then on the right-hand side, we see the average duration of those trips. And so what we find quite interesting and quite intuitive is that you see this somewhat of a negative correlation, so to speak, in terms of the COVID stringency, in terms of more of the lockdowns, less of the driving, naturally. But what we can also see, and it's quite clear on both charts, is that driving is actually very highly seasonal, which typically total kilometers traveled often peaks around Q3, meaning around the summertime. And what we're seeing is that while they're slowly rising to pre-pandemic levels, there is the average trip length in kilometers have actually increased over time. And largely some of that is just towards more domestic travel for consumer leisure or perhaps for commercial purposes. So this tells us just a small glimpse in terms of some of the consumer behavior patterns that we're seeing from Canadians. If we move on to the next slide here. And this is another great slide, which also reinforces some of these ideas, right? Is that this was based on the survey, and it looks to understand how much driving have you been doing? And so this was for the reference here, 2020 during the pandemic, so consistent with the previous slide, that almost 2/3 of those respondents found that they were riding slightly less. So there's fewer kilometers driven over the previous year. At the same time, there was also questions around, well, how much of those surveyed would you be doing some repairs on your own? And a large proportion of them, it was over 85% of those individuals surveyed, did not do any do-yourself repairs since the start of the pandemic. But if we focus on those that did, so the 15%, or close to 15%, then it was often around the oil changes, tire change or tire pressure checks, brakes or brake pads, in terms of checks or replacements, were among the repairs that were done most frequently during this time period. So very interesting to see how this has evolved over time. We go to the next slide. This is where we get great information to understand the frequency in which some of the replacement rates were put into place. So what this really measures is how often those Canadians have been replacing certain parts. And from a percentage perspective, if you see oil changes 150%, the best way to think about this is that on average, someone has changed their oil twice in, say, 3 years, right? And then in this case, for windshield wiper, it means that they tend to replace the wiper fluid about once every 2 years is another simple way of considering this. But what we often see is that on the left-hand side, yeah, I guess this wouldn't be all that surprising. What we find quite interesting is on the right-hand side is the percentage of Canadians that have delayed vehicle maintenance, but it's actually based on the age of the vehicle itself. And so here you see this natural U-curve occurring, meaning that for newer cars, oftentimes there's slightly less delays in terms of vehicle maintenance. So we think about those that are more essential or non-essential repairs are more frequent for newer cars. But then as the car is much older, so say it's 12 plus years, then there's likely a case that they're focusing on more on the drivability and likely to delay a lot of non-essential repairs, meaning that in the context of an older car, they just want to make sure that it's running, whereas those that fall in between around the 4 to 7 years, it's likely the case that those are some cars that are coming out of warranty and they're slowly entering this market and not delaying vehicle repairs as often. So I find this quite a powerful graph to understand of how is it certain vehicles are entering the aftermarket segment and to what extent they are doing so. If we move on to the next slide, I think this is a great example to showcase and highlight the resiliency, we'll call it, in some of the markets, right? So if we focus, so this here focuses on the revenues in most aftermarket industries, and we find that, yes, with the exception of a blip in 2020, it's been somewhat resilient over time, and you see this quite substantial across different segments. At the same time, on the right-hand side, you see that the revenue has been breakdown through more on the mechanical and other automotive and repair and maintenance parts. And of course, a lot of this, as we expect, has been highly correlated with the markets in terms of what we expect. So in this case, I think it is a success in terms of where they are, in terms of weathering the storm, so to speak. But I think the big takeaway is that there is a level of resiliency that we can expect even in the coming months or the next few quarters, if we do believe we're entering into a recessionary period. In saying that, we'll now move on to a benchmarking analysis. Now, this is really just looking at key economic measures across comparable jurisdictions, and how is it that the aftermarket motor segment compares to these areas. So Ryan, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mauricio. So as a new addition to the Outlook Study 2022, we've looked at several indicators to gauge how Canada has performed in comparison to other major economies. So the first indicator we look at was GDP. So as you can see on the left-hand side, Canada has suffered a larger contraction in 2020 among the 4 jurisdictions being compared here, with GDP declining by over 5% relative to 2019. In contrast, the US and Australia, they saw lower impact from the pandemic. Fortunately, the Canadian economy's recovery in the following year, 2021, has been very strong. GDP was inches away from the pre-pandemic levels, but at the same time, when we look at the other jurisdictions, the recoveries that took place in the US and Australia have already pushed their GDP past the 2019 levels last year. In terms of the aftermarket sector's contributions to the national economy, the US has shown a significantly higher share relative to other jurisdictions. The aftermarket sector in the US made up about 3% of the national GDP. And when we look at really from the structure of the lifestyle perspective, part of the reason is many US communities are car-centric, so they only offer very limited public transit options, which necessitates vehicle ownership. And this creates a higher demand for the automotive services and products. And when we get into more of the sectorial indicators, we look at the vehicle registrations and kilometers driven per vehicle, which are the key indicators of the sector demand across jurisdictions. Canada's vehicle registrations per capita was higher than Australia and the UK in 2020, averaging about 750 cars per 1,000 residents. This roughly translates into 2 vehicles per household. And the US naturally has one of the highest vehicle ownership per capita globally, which was about 50% higher than Canada. And prior to the pandemic, the United States and Canada had comparable kilometers driven per vehicles registered. On average, each vehicle registered in Canada has traveled about 16,000 kilometers in 2019. This further confirms that the number of vehicles on the road will be a key demand drivers for the aftermarket sector. So this is how we look at Canada's current positioning relative to other jurisdictions. And now I will pass it back to Mauricio to discuss the trends that will impact the automotive aftermarket industries going forward.
Thank you, Ryan. So I think this is an area that I get quite excited about, admittedly, because this is the data we have is fantastic, and it really paints a nice picture within Canada of what those potential trends are going forward. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that this great data we have from S&P Global highlights 2 different areas. One is the potential forecast for new vehicle registrations that are electric, so new EVs, and you can see this large growth. And then on the right-hand side, what I find more interesting is how the distribution of those new vehicle registrations by fuel type change over this period. So naturally, right now, at the current state in 2021, almost 9 out of every 10 cars, it has an internal combustion engine, with a small proportion of them being battery electrical vehicles. But as going forward, it's the annual registration forecast is looking to increase to about 668,000 units by 2028. And what we're seeing here is the proportions are changing dramatically. So you'll not only see battery electric vehicles, but also a large growth in plug-in hybrid vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, And you're now going to slowly start seeing that the ICE vehicles are now going to be the minority. So what does that all tell us when we think about this from the aftermarket? So if we dive in a little bit deeper on this data, if we go to the next slide, we can actually see what the breakdowns are, which is great. So you think about at the aggregate, electrical vehicles only tells one story, but who are the makers behind these, right? And this is where it tells you for 2021, who are those top vehicles registration. And so you often see that Tesla is among the most popular one in Canada, the Model 3 leading this, and with about 37%. And the 26% here, it's in color code as others, that represents the notable measures of Volkswagen, Chevrolet, BMW, Mercedes, and such. But the idea here is you're seeing this growth from Tesla, in particular Model 3 has been very popular in Canada, a lot of uptake around the Model Y as well, since its release in 2020. But outside of those high-end segments, EVs are becoming more affordable and actually entering the standard household. And so because of that, you're going to see a lot of growth in particular areas. So the Toyota Prius, the Chevrolet Bolt, and the Hyundai Kona, and then in future models as well, you will continue to expect this trend going forward. But that's just on the EV side. But if we think about more broadly, what does that mean? Well, there's two aspects to think about it. One is on the consumer side. Well, what is that expectation in terms of changes in CPI or inflationary periods? What is it that we expect? We are entering an area where it's quite high. This is a very dynamic situation in which we're always waiting on new numbers to come out. The expectations is that year over year, it's going to be reduced, but to what extent is always going to be an interesting question. And then also from the business perspective, you have to think about the producer price index or the product price index, which actually just measures the cost or the other pull through that goes to fundamentally the cost towards some of these products. And we have to think about, well, what does that really mean? Well, I mean, a lot of these vehicle manufacturers and even owners have been facing these cost pressures. And so because of that, there's only going to be, to an extent, where you can continue to either pass on some of these costs, or is it where you're going to share some of those costs between the consumers and the businesses? So because of that, we're seeing a lot of this push on the supply chain and the bottlenecks that are occurring. High price costs for energy and other inputs is going to play a critical role going forward. And how is it that we see this market evolving over time? And if we just move to the last slide here, this is great because it just gives a very quick snapshot of the consumer behavior perspective. It's just really understanding, well, we saw how many total vehicles and kilometers have been traveled over time and how sensitive certain consumers are now becoming. So for those ICE-based vehicles, you can see this negative correlation of sorts of average gasoline prices and actually total vehicles kilometer traveled. So in the short term, you're seeing this, but more so in the long term, what we intend or what we expect is there's going to be a shift away from these ICE vehicles towards to EVs. And this is where you'll see a slightly less correlation at the aggregate, but I suspect as you get deeper into the analysis, this will continue to persist, especially if we have these higher than these high and persistent gasoline prices. So in saying that, this concludes our summary level of our analysis, and we're more than happy to enter the Q&A. Shamsia, over to you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Very interesting results. So I'll give the EY team a little bit of a break and pose my first question to JF. Jeff, we've seen some interesting data points, some new data points from the 2020 Outlook study. Perhaps you can spell out for our members what are the new features they can expect from this Outlook study?
Well, absolutely. So, Shamsi, the AIA is basically continuing on its commitment to provide more relevant data to our members, and I guess that's their first goal. And we're also continuing to work, as you saw, with reputable, recognizable research firm such as we have EY. We have here today, S&P, or formerly IHS, and IMR, who've all contributed to this Outlook study. But But beyond that, we're also adapting the structure of the report. So we're looking for like a shorter written report that's going to provide a high level of information for like quick understanding. And then we're going to start to provide also something like a data visualization tool, like a companion Excel document that's going to include more granular data. So for those who'd like to do a deep dive into the number, they're going to be able to do so as a separate element to the report. So, I guess that in short, there's going to be some of the changes that you could expect when you actually put your hands on this 22 report. Back to you, Shamsia.
Right. Thank you, Jeff, for outlining that. And I'll just let the members know that they can download the report, the executive summary, and also the data visualization tool as an Excel document. So it sort of all goes together as a neat package that we've put together for all of you. All right. The next question is for both EY and also Jeff. I'm going to put this question to you, but I'll let the EY team go first. So for an industry that is already riddled with the labor shortages, even before the pandemic, then we saw a job loss of at the upwards of 28,000, though we have recovered some of those numbers. What does the future look like for our industry in terms of employment?
And that's a fair question. Very tough to answer as well, because I think with the labor shortages, a lot of this is around the markets and the shortages of other sectors as well, and really understanding how is it that someone can work in what I'll call somewhat similar sectors, although with similar skill sets. And so that will consistently persist. I think it's around understanding the pipeline of talent and to be able to upskill and reskill some of these individuals. I think there's going to be a continued increase in shortages, especially around technicians, because of, say, the growth in EVs. To be able to repair this is going to be very tricky. To diagnose them is going to be just as difficult. And there's new information coming out all the time on how to do this, and a lot of new innovative technologies they're going to do so. So it is impactful, because not only from a cost perspective, you see wages are high, there's also those that are leaving, but then also you have this pent-up demand. You have all these customers that you're looking to treat, but you can't do so. So it's also impacting from the revenue perspective. So it's hitting your top line, your costs, which fundamentally hits your bottom line as well. So it is a certain interesting area, but it's around really trying to manage, reskill, upskill the current labor, and try to make this as a positive story as we can. Jeff?
Yeah, Mauricio, I'll echo what you're saying. It's really going to be the focus of our members to making sure they continue to be very focused on attractions of labor, working on the retention of the existing labor we have in the space, and all the challenges related to the upskilling of the workforce as technology continues to impact the sector. I will just add that we know this is a prime concern for AIA members. Each time we talk to our members, they're the primary concern. What keeps them up at night is labor challenges. And I'd just add that AIA Canada is already at work to get even more practical information and data on that particular challenge. And I guess stay posted into 2023 to get even more information coming from AIA on finding some practical applications and solutions to navigate those difficult challenges.
Thanks, JF. And I'll let you continue, because there are some progressive businesses, like we've outlined some of the challenges here, but there are some progressive businesses who perhaps deploy some innovative strategies. Jeff, is there something you have noticed in your interaction with members that you can perhaps share that would help some of the other businesses struggling with similar challenges?
No question, Shamsia. The more progressive, the more resilient organizations are already, hard at work. They're the one who will remain, I would say, agile, informed. They're the organization that are likely listening to this webinar. They're going to be, deep diving into the report, and they're making investments, whether it's in technology, in the tools, in training, in their people, and I can only think about our recent curbside chat webinar we had with Chris Bessener. So here's a typical automotive service provider who is now pivoting to servicing more EVs, investing in its people, its tool, its process. And so there are a wide variety of those examples that exist whereby people in the aftermarket are essentially doubling down and making those investments to stay ahead of these challenges. And I know those are all pretty good strategies to follow.
Thank you, JF. Just changing gears a little bit over here, and a question for EY. What I heard from the presentation, Mauricio, perhaps you mentioned this, is that we are a resilient industry, and the bounce back for 2021 has been pretty impressive, but we are still not back to pre-pandemic levels. How long is this recovery going to take? I know it's still early, but how many years are we looking at?
Yeah, very difficult question indeed. But what we can say is based on the forecast that we've seen on some, even historically coming out of the pandemic, certain subsegments within there have a slightly different recovery, right? So you're seeing some what we refer to as an L curve, which is a slightly going increase, but some are actually quite quick in terms of the rebound, as we call it, as a V-shaped recovery. But what we often look for in terms of the near term, so the next 3 to 6 to 9 months, is we look at what we refer to as leading indicators. So meaning indicators that can help give us just a glimpse of what we think will have an impact, as opposed to looking back or lagging indicators. And I think the data that we have around kilometers driven is great because it's telling us that's what people are actually, they're actually using the cars, they're actually going out there. The fact I think it's been helpful for local Canadians is with the shutdown from travel. It means that there's been a lot of more domestic travel, and that's great. So now people are actually looking to travel those distances on a much broader basis. We actually saw that in the data in Q3. That's the highest kilometer per car driven. So I suspect that those type of trends will continue to persist over the period. In addition to the resiliency of the market, I believe that we will be on track for full recovery soon. Now, soon, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of whether it's 12 months or 18 months, but I'll just state it that way.
All right, I guess we'll be happy with soon for now, which is still better than some of the other industries we see. On a similar note, what is the impact the macro environment is going to have on the demand for aftermarket products and services? We see a slowing down of the Canadian economy, higher inflation, higher gas prices, the housing market is sort of crashing, if I could use that term loosely. So what is this environment? How is that going to impact the aftermarket?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, when we're looking at non-essential items or essential items for some of these car repair and maintenance, I mean, they're often more non-discretionary. So I suspect, as we'll see going forward, some of that will continue to be somewhat resilient. Now, what does that mean for, say, purchases of new cars? Or other areas? I think it's going to have an impact, certainly. And we're often seeing already in some of the data that some people or consumers are holding on to their cars longer, which actually in effect has a positive impact to this industry. So those that were saying, perhaps I'm leasing every 3 years, maybe I buy this one now and I hold on to this for the moment. Or those that have, perhaps you're saying, okay, I have an older car. And as we saw, maybe rather than just focus on the drivability, maybe I'm going to actually spend that because I believe that I'm going to keep this for another 5 or 6 years. So we're seeing some of that in the data side of it. So I think there is a positive story to be told there.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned new vehicles because we've seen some supply chain disruptions that have resulted in a shortage of new vehicles. How will that impact? Because the general understanding is that a new vehicle will come into the aftermarket the next 5-6 years once the warranty period is over. So what are these shortages? How are they going to impact the industry a couple of years down the line?
Yeah, and that's a great question because I think you see that in one of our graphs, we have this U curve where there's more maintenance for, which may sound almost counterintuitive for newer cars, so to speak. So what does that mean for the pipeline going forward? And you're absolutely right. The turnaround on some of those cars might slow down, but I would actually argue you'd have to also think about the other side of the coin, which means that you're also holding on to cars longer, which means that there's going to be additional spent on some of these cars. So while you might have a pipeline of potential inventory either sitting there or with the shortages and waiting for certain materials to come in. So we all know there's chip shortages for certain critical parts of cars. While there's a delay in that aspect, I mean, we're seeing that Canadians are still driving. So that just means that there are going to be repairs in other areas. So while there might be a reduction in one area, there might be an improvement on another. So in that sense, what is the net effect? I mean, it just goes to show you that the aftermarket automotive industry is well positioned, I suppose, going forward.
I like that, well positioned. I hope we stay well positioned. Now, since we're on the topic of new vehicle registrations, we've seen this trend of light trucks, SUVs, pickups. And is this trend expected to continue, especially given the rising gas prices? I mean, these cars are gas guzzlers. So, can you comment on how this might impact our sector?
No, of course. I mean, I think that's been a trend we've seen for a number of years now, with this shift towards light trucks as opposed to just standard passenger vehicles. I suspect that's where there's going to be a lot of growth. So we saw in the data that the Model Y, as an example, has been been growing in popularity, because you're right, there's this, if we think about a substitutive effect, you go from a typically say, okay, I have a small vehicle, a passenger vehicle, to a light truck. Now it's going to say, maybe I'm doing a switch from an ICE to an EV. And the EV side of it is, well, is it a light truck EV? And that's where you're seeing the growth in the Model Y perspective. So there is a lot there. You're right. And, the big question becomes are there products out there in terms of new EVs that are actually fall into the light truck category? And I think that's where you're likely to see all the growth. And that's where we suspect we might see that as well.
All right, thank you, Mauricio. I want to move to JF now, and we saw this comparison, this benchmarking with other jurisdictions, US, UK, Australia. I just want to understand your thinking behind going in this new direction in the 2022 Outlook study. JF?
Yeah, sure, Shamsia. AIA Canada is increasingly engaged with the numerous sister associations around the world. Our own members increasingly are impacted by global markets. So it makes sense for us to start to look our own performance in Canada through the lens of other markets and jurisdictions and learn a bit from those dynamics. We're very engaged on the file on right to repair as an example, and we see jurisdictions such as Australia are moving ahead on that front. And so, can we learn a bit of their impact and how it's going to provide us some insights as to what we can be doing here in Canada? I'll reference again our curbside chat, the second last episode we had John Washbish from the Alliance, a US-based organization, who came and talked about the fact that the solutions for challenges such as right to repair, needs global collaboration. It's a global solutions to a global problem. And so, what you're seeing here in the Outlook study is exactly that, is to having the association really providing a more global perspective in the data we provide to members.
Thank you, JF. I think we try to lead from the front by bringing in globalization, by comparing with jurisdictions. And that's the way to go, really. Global problems need global solutions. Thank you, JF, for that. Now, this is an open question, and Eva, if you want to answer this, or JF, if you want to jump on it, it's good with me. The biggest takeaway from 2020 was that e-tailing, or having a digital presence, it was already a big talking point among businesses, and the pandemic sort of accelerated that drive for having a strong digital presence. So, what's the biggest takeaway from the 2022 Outlook study in terms of having a digital presence? Like, is that a given now? It's like everybody needs to be on board and everybody needs to look at their website critically.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in first. So I think you're right. I think there's two elements here. One is you're absolutely right. That was a big takeaway from the 2020 study. And I think that to me should be a given. We should continue to do so. I think now more than ever, as we think about consumers entering this again, we'll call it a loom and gloom view. We're unsure as to where we're operating. They're going to be quite careful on how they spend that discretionary dollar for potentially non-essential repairs, and even essential. They want to be smart about that, right? It's always been a question of who can provide me the biggest value add towards that. So I think digital presence should certainly be there. But I think from here, and Jeff, I'll let you see what your takeaways. But for me, the big takeaway for this 2022 report is actually just the rise of EVs and how important that is. and from several different angles, not only just the repair aspect, because we all know that in comparison to ICE vehicles, there's less frequent, scheduled checkups for certain areas. But think not only from the maintenance side itself, but how you diagnose them. What are the challenges to do so? And then the shortages around both the capability of doing so, so having the proper diagnosis, but the capacity of doing so. Do we even have enough shops that could do this type of work? And then if it's true, what about the labor aspect as well? So I think there's this big need in this market, in the Canadian market, that I feel is a great opportunity for those to invest or to think about either reskilling, upskilling the labor side, making those investments and understanding how you diagnose some of these problems. And you're seeing this a lot for certain EV manufacturers at the moment, especially those are coming out of warranty. So Tesla's a great example. They were, one of the first movers in this area. Now you're seeing a lot more of those used EVs, used Tesla Model 3s out there, the Model S. And how is it that you repair that? It's always been a very big question you're seeing, not only in Canada, but globally as well.
Yeah. Well, maybe what I could add here, there's two things here. The first one is the whole e-tailing aspect. We knew e-tailing was growing. The pandemic has simply just accelerated at great pace the capacity of consumers, the wish of consumers to transact online, and further enhance the need for anyone in the aftermarket to adapt to that reality and offer that service to their customers, whether it's to book appointments for repair, being able to transact for the selling of parts online to their business customers, and so on. So that's obviously has just accelerated what we saw already as a trend. To your point, Mauricio, on EV, I always like to say EVs are first and foremost computers on wheels. They further reinforces the fact that the vehicles of tomorrow are going to be increasingly through the lens of remote diagnostic, onboard computer analysis, calibrations, and other services that are going to come from servicing increasingly more connected type of vehicle. And so we're always curious, and it's going to be hard to tell, how fast we are going to see, in fact, the integrations of EVs as part of the mix of new car sales. We talked about the disruptions on the side of car makers still, today to be able to deliver new cars. The question is as they're accelerating the deployment of all these new type of EVs, will they be able to keep up with demand? And so if there's still shortage of these type of vehicles, is that going to slow down a bit the sale of these new vehicles, despite the efforts by governments to really accelerate the adoption of those vehicles? That's going to be very interesting. But when you wrap it all up, whether it's on the e-tailing or the fact that we need to increasingly serve computers on wheels, these factors makes it so that the digital transformation in the aftermarket needs to take place and accelerate for the people who wants to stay in the game for the future.
Thank you, JF. And my next question is sort of aligned with what you've mentioned about the Government of Canada and the vision and goals that they've set for 2035. From the results that were presented, we see by a 45% increase of EVs by 2028. That is still not close to what the government has set the target. So are we going to see this additional push from the government to meet those targets? What's going to happen beyond 2028? If we can make some assumptions, some estimations here based on what the research that we've done.
Yeah, happy to do so. I think for this case, you're right. Are we on pace? Probably not, but I think it's at the same time when these targets were put in place, COVID was unheard of, so to speak, right? So I think there will likely be certain areas where there'll be some realignment of what those targets should be or should likely be, because again, it wasn't necessarily just the lockdowns per se, but it really just put an emphasis and showcase the global vulnerability of our supply chains, right? Like, I think that's one of the key takeaways from what we learned in the past 12, 18 months. So yeah, I personally think with some of these areas, the growth more so not only just on vehicles registered, but I think it's always going to be important to think about, we'll still continue to go down that path. They'll just be slightly revised.
Yeah, I'll just add that no question we're going to see an accelerations, much greater growth on the adoptions of EVs. How fast this growth will come in again will be a bit determined by governments. And frankly, I always called their target to be inspirational rather than a practical, view of the world. But we could still see the adoptions of EV mandates that would push manufacturers to offer a certain percentage of their new vehicles as EVs. This might be something we could see. Question is still open whether or not car manufacturer would still be able to supply even with some EV mandates. But I think we're going to see potential some more movement by government that may influence the adoption rate of EVs by Canadians.
All right, thank you, JF. We touched upon inflation, and right now we're seeing inflation increase in Canada, unprecedented levels. So, what is that going to mean for the aftermarket industry, and in comparison to perhaps other sectors like agriculture, oil and mining, what kind of impact is that going to have on the aftermarket sector?
Sure. So, I mean, I think if we step back and just what we think over the next, few years is going to occur. I mean, I think with the monetary policies are currently in place, so quantitative tightening is what they were referencing at the point. The ease of supply chain shortages. So over time, we're now slowly starting to see that in terms of either diversification in terms of supply chains or actually just streamlining them as we go forward. But also the reduced demand as well for certain products and services will actually help calm this inflation down over the next few years. So I think that's, you think about breaking down in certain points, we will see that. And that's what's certain. The question is when. This is always a point, but we're slowly starting to see this dissipate. But the impact to the sector itself is quite mixed, right? Because you think about two sides of it, right? The downside of it is that yes, we have elevated prices and the wages will likely stay in place for some time. But the upside towards that is oftentimes prices is what we refer to as sticky, meaning that they don't come down as fast, right? So having those elevated prices for some time while we continue to manage other parts of the business would actually be quite beneficial to the businesses as inflation eases. So hopefully that answers your question, Champagne.
It does. And absolutely, if our members listening in, if they have any further questions, they can definitely email us. Mauricio, back when we last met in 2020, it was October. We had not seen a vaccine yet for COVID, and one of the big questions was, when are vaccines going to appear? We're seeing these shutdowns and restrictions and social distancing. There's so much uncertainty. I guess my question is, can we safely put all of those behind? Can we truly say that we're in a post-pandemic period and we're done with these third and fourth and fifth waves of COVID?
Yeah, so I would call this to be cautiously optimistic. I think moving forward, we are entering the fall. We are seeing this becoming an endemic situation, which is great. But it's also very difficult to track and to measure now because often, not only just in Canada, but also in other parts of the world, those that were tracking either hospitalization rates, infection rates, and death rates, those systems that were in place by either federal or provincial have been disbanded. So it'd be very difficult to assess what those are. We are seeing anecdotally in the news and just in the markets in general that there is this uptake over time around COVID in terms of hospitalization. What I suspect may happen is that I don't believe politically we'll ever go back to a lockdown as to where we are. So that I can almost safely assume that it's going to be behind us. But what I suspect if I was the government or how they would operate is just to be mindful that that is still around and just to be cautious on how we interact with one another, maintain that distance where you can, and just use the proper protocols, right? Now, in saying all of that, will that have an impact on the sector? I think so. In terms of areas, some people are just said, you know what, I'm sick of this and I'm going to go forward with it. So a little bit of a mixed bag, but I do think if I were to summarize it, I would say cautiously optimistic moving forward.
All right, we'll be cautiously optimistic. What about oil prices over the next 2 years? How would this impact particularly travel demand? Like we saw travel come back with a vengeance over the summer. So how's that going to be impacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's very interesting because the among analysts right now, the projections are very mixed, right? So you're seeing low numbers to 80, upwards to 150. And we think about some of those factors. We think about, demand from China, and then geopolitical tensions is always quite large. But then just more recently, over the last, I think, past few days or last week, around OPEC cutting production. So that was something very new to everyone. So we do expect oil prices to continue to be elevated for some time. The question becomes is how is it that the markets react towards that? Because for certain areas that are large consumers of oil and gas, so you think about a lot of distribution and movement of goods, that's certainly going to have an impact on supply chain, which will ultimately have a cost, it'd be an increase in cost for everyone. So, as we hear about certain factors and levers going up and down in terms of what the inflation period, I think this is something very new that everyone's trying to figure out right now. And I do believe from at the aggregate, oil prices will probably remain elevated for some time.
I'm just going to make a quick comment, and I sort of put you on the spot, Mauricio. We didn't touch the Ukraine war, and if that's going to have any impact on the global aftermarket front, like what kind of impact will that have, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think for something like the war, it's been more impactful to European nations, I suppose, because they're the ones more I'll call it reliant on some of the issues that are rising from that. I think on our end, in terms of the national kind of aftermarket, I wouldn't say necessarily it would be a non-issue, but I think it's an area that we should be thinking about. But I don't think it'd be a material factor in terms of what some of those impacts could be.
All right, thank you, Mauricio. Jeff, we've heard about COVID lockdowns, we've heard about oil prices, inflation. What do all of these results mean for the industry?
Well, I think it validates that we need to continue to do what we do as an association for the industry. And that is, we need to continue to invest in provide valuable information, data to the industry, because as you pointed out, it remains very dynamic. It remains very uncertain in terms of, what's ahead of us. So I think the industry needs to remain agile. The association needs to remain agile and be able to adapt to this ongoing evolution. And I guess what it means for us as an association and for industry is to all of us collectively remain very engaged in sharing that information, that data. So, we're better positions to make more informed decision as our future evolves, in front of our eyes. I guess that would be sort of the view of the future at this point.
Thank you, JF. So I've run out of questions to ask, but are there any comments or anything that you think is relevant to be added to this discussion?
Well, maybe I'll just take the opportunity again to thank the people from EY for their continuing partnership and providing the great commentary we heard today. And I think it's through those partnership, again, across sectors and with partnerships like this, that we are able, in fact, to stay engaged and stay informed. So again, thank you for your participation.
Thank you, JF. And I think on that note, we will end this webinar, but I would like to encourage our members to please reach out to us with your comments, feedback, and questions. We want to keep the engagement going, as I mentioned in the beginning. And I hope you found this webinar useful. I hope you find the report and the accompanying data visualization tool useful. They're all free for our members to download from our website. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the EY team, and JF, thank you for your perspective as well.